Before we get into today's video, if you're unaware, I have recently joined Spotify and Apple's podcasting platform where you can listen to this show in podcast format, audio only. People have been asking for it, and a lot of you have signed up, and I thank you for it. But without further ado, let's get into today's video. One of my favorite words that has become a part of the political lexicon in recent years, and it's actually sadly well underutilized, is the word regressive. And this is meant to describe people who call themselves progressives, yet they're advocating for backtracking on policies, specifically on racial issues. So these people are trying to reinstitute racial discrimination, more or less, in the name of racial progress. And a lot of people say, Sean, that's an overplayed phenomenon. Sean, that's not a legitimate thing. Sean, there are no people trying to reinstitute discrimination in the name of wokeness or progressiveness. You're just making that up. Pay no attention to the segregated dorms on Ivy League campuses, segregated blacks-only graduations, and all these other things meant to separate people based on race and sexual orientation, like in years past, that are now viewed as good because, minorities just need their own space. We need to be free from the whites because we all know the color of your skin. Wait a minute, oh my god, we're saying some racist ass crap. Now, today what we're going to talk about is this going one step further. Today we're going to talk about how people's jobs are going to be at stake according to a teachers union contract recently signed in the city of Minneapolis that calls for white teachers to be fired first in any case where there may or may not be layoffs. But before we get into that, this video is sponsored. We're going to talk about your diet, so I'll toss it over to the sponsor and then we'll come back over here and talk about it on the other side. There's a diet that's out there that's really popular among celebrities, among athletes, and about 13 million Americans are on it right now. Of course, it's called the keto diet, and the way it works in principle is you reduce the amount of energy that you're getting for carbs and you substitute it with other things. And in fact, members of my own family, including my mother, are on the keto diet. But the thing is, for normal everyday people, results can be slow. This is one of the reasons why you need something to boost you up and why I recommend Keto with Justice. This powder enhances a lot of the factors of the keto diet, can help produce ketones and prolong your state of ketosis. It's one of the reasons why I get this, and I give it to my own mother, so that's the way you know it's definitely trustworthy. And one of the great things about this is that you can get this powder from ketowithjustice.com for 51% off. Also, if you decide you're not into it, if you decide you're not about that weight loss life, there's a 60-day money-back guarantee. So again, keto powder, ketowithjustice.com, 50% off, and a 60-day money-back guarantee. So in March of 2022, the Minneapolis Teachers Union actually went on strike for the first time since around 1970, and this was thought to be originally due to the things that teachers are bothered about these days when it comes to the post-pandemic era. And of course, that is showing up to school, having to actually teach, because God forbid people who are employed by your tax dollars actually teach your kids in person, when we know for a fact that in-person learning is far more effective than remote learning. I mean, children during the course of the pandemic in these left-wing cities that refused to open schools despite the fact that it was perfectly safe to do so ended up falling years behind due to their absence from learning institutions. But that's not what it was all about, apparently. This 14-day strike was actually to get the city of Minneapolis to come to the bargaining table and to add in some incredibly questionable provisions when it comes to racial politics, because of course we're talking about the city of Minneapolis, and this is the post not only COVID era, but the post George Floyd era. And in the name of saving George Floyd, in the name of stopping Officer Derek Chauvin from putting his knee on George Floyd's neck all over again, the city of Minneapolis Teachers Union has negotiated a deal that of course institutes, codifies into the agreement racial discrimination against white people, because discriminating based on race is wrong, but if you do it against white people, it's kind of progressive and awesome, and they're on board for it. Now, this is not hyperbole, this isn't a joke, this isn't somebody reading something into the law or into the contract that is not there. This is actually explicitly said in multiple different places beyond what is being reported by your everyday news outlets, that this is going to be a part of the new package in this teachers' collective bargaining agreement. Now, the contract actually kicks in 2023, and if you notice throughout the contract, the way they refer to firing or laying off teachers or furloughing teachers is by the phrase excessing. And you just need to know, anytime I'm using the phrase excessing, even if you've never heard of it in this context, what I'm referring to is firing. And what used to happen in our public school systems, which by the way was not a good system, is that teachers were excessed or fired whenever there were cutbacks on staff based on seniority. So no matter your performance, it just matters what time you showed up, how long you've been there, and that would determine the pecking order of which teachers would get fired. Now, according to the Minneapolis Teachers Union, this led to too many minorities being fired because minorities have only recently pushed, I guess, to enter teaching fields. Therefore, they needed to institute a new system that would preserve these minority teachers because they're incredibly valuable to the students and the very diverse population in the city of Minneapolis. Now, just so you know, in case you're wondering, in case you're curious, performance does not factor in any way, shape, or form into these teachers union contracts. It never does. If you were worried about people gaining benefits that were unearned based on seniority, then maybe you could institute something related to performance, but that was never on the table. It was never negotiated for. If you show up and you stay in the time for a certain period of time, it doesn't matter how crappy you are, if they didn't fire you within the first 3 years, then you can enjoy lifetime benefits, lifetime healthcare, and your seniority still plays a major role in how you're treated by these institutions and in the city of Minneapolis. However, what they've actually changed up in this situation is that they've decided to weight race more than seniority, because we all know that long-term engagement in the union is not important to the union anymore if the union is loaded up with evil old white people. So now what they're actually doing, and this says it in the contract itself, is laying off people based on race first, and if somebody who is a minority comes up, they will search for the next white person with the lowest level of seniority. Quote, starting with the spring of 2023 budget tie-out cycle, if accessing a teacher who is a member of a population underrepresented among licensed teachers in the site, the district shall access the next least senior teacher who is not a member of an underrepresented population, the contract reads. There's also language in the contract that says minority teachers may also be exempted from district-wide layoffs outside the seniority order and given priority reinstatement according to this contract. So like I just said, what this means is that the Minneapolis City Council, who negotiates with the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers, have brokered a deal where if you are going to start firing people and a minority comes up in your seniority pecking order, they're not going to get rid of the seniority pecking order and go after performance. They are going to look for the next closest white person and fire that person. And if cuts get so dire, if you end up firing so many teachers that minorities actually end up getting fired, so you end up in a system where you're only in a minority seniority order situation, then guess what? They're going to be reinstated first, not those evil white teachers who wanted to educate kids, because we all know that getting your teacher's license as a white person is just proof positive of your evil white racism. Now, it actually goes beyond this. A lot of the focus has been on teachers, but if you actually read the language of the contract really closely, what you'll find out is this is actually applicable to all licensed staff in the schools, no matter the position. So basically, what would happen if you had, a spike in crime due to the fact that you were defunding the police after the George Floyd situation, people fleeing your city due to the fact that you're allowing all this crime and support rioting and cheer it on, and that you have a weak, softer version of Justin Trudeau as your mayor, and that decimates your tax base, and thus you will in the future have to make cuts to the public schools. Well, guess what? The Minneapolis School District and the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers have arranged this in such a way that white people disproportionately feel the brunt of this when it comes to people employed by the public school system. Now, on top of everything that I just said, the contract actually protects the teachers that are employed at 15 different public schools that are considered minority isolated institutions. So in every other part of the school district, you're going to have a system where if there are layoffs, then they're going to find the nearest white person, fire them, tell them that they can't feed their kids because they happen to be born white and we're trying to solve racism here, so get out of here based on the color of your skin. But within these 15 minority school districts that have disproportionately minority staffs, these these people are going to be elevated above all the other districts, and they will be last out, last touched by any budget cuts, because guess what? There's more poverty in that area, and we can't just punish poverty. And what's wild about this is that normally what the left does in response to you pointing out when they're instituting or proposing some level of racist policy in the name of equity, in the name of racial justice, in the name of cosmic justice, because there's minorities out there in the past, long dead, that are hurt by this racism, and therefore we need to balance the cosmic scales because racial justice is that powerful that we need to punish current white people for the plight of previous black people and help actually no one, is that they're not even denying it. When contacted by the Daily Caller, the Minneapolis Public Schools and their spokeswoman, Christina Lugo Beach, reiterated to the Daily Caller that yes, this was in fact happening, but don't worry about it. It's all about remedying the continuing effects of past discrimination. Minneapolis schools and the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers mutually agreed to contract language that aims to support the recruitment and retention of teachers from underrepresented groups as compared to the labor market and the communities served by the school district. Now, what's wild about this is that normally there's some ambiguity there. Normally there's something that Democratic Party officials, when they propose this open and blatant racism against white people, can hide behind in order to obfuscate what they're actually doing. They'll say, oh, well, race might be something that we're considering because we're not going to be colorblind. We're going to acknowledge color, but work to undo the systemic systems of racism. But the thing is, in the contract itself, it says that they're trying to remedy past discrimination based on absolute objective nonsense. Let me read the quote for you so you can understand what I'm saying. Quote, "The race-based firing is intended to make up for past discrimination by the district, disproportionately impacting the hiring of underrepresented teachers in the district, as compared to the relevant labor market and the community. This disparity resulted in a lack of diversity of teachers, according to the contract." So this is racism of the gaps nonsense, and one of the ways that you know that for sure is that if the main issue was the relevant labor market, i.e. there were black people who were qualified to be teachers that weren't hired due to past discrimination, then you wouldn't need the second part of that sentence. But the second part of that sentence is all about the population surrounding the schools, and therefore, if you don't have a teaching staff within the schools that match exactly the pie chart of America or that district within the schools, somehow there's racism because there's a gap between the population and those teaching in the schools. But the thing is, we know for sure that gaps and disparities and all that exist naturally throughout our entire economy. Disproportionately, a lot of African migrants, the women, end up becoming nurses. If you saw disproportionately Nigerian nurses at a hospital to the surrounding population, that wouldn't necessarily be indicative of discrimination. We also know that women typically go into public education. They're way more likely to be teachers, by orders of magnitude more likely to be teachers. That is not necessarily evidence of discrimination just because the men in the surrounding area aren't as interested in teaching as women tend to be. But yet, there it is in the contract. The teachers not matching the area that happens to be called the school district is evidence on its own of racial discrimination. Now, because this is blatantly and obviously unconstitutional, a violation of the Civil Rights Act, it is discrimination in the laws, in the system, so this would be the systemic structures of structural oppression. The Minneapolis Federation of Teachers had the sense to not respond to the Daily Caller's request for comment because they all know that when challenged, this should be struck down. But it's absolutely wild that this was not only proposed, but it actually made it through the contract phase. You actually had people allegedly representing the taxpayers and people allegedly representing the teachers, aka the teachers union, agreeing that race should be a determining factor in who gets hired and who gets fired by this contract. And by the way, this is actually not that new when it comes to Minnesota. We did a video a while back. It actually started the Stop K-12 Indoctrination series on this channel about the Edina School District instituting racial equity curriculum and, of course, tanking the scores in their #1 school district. But this curriculum was so hardcore in their anti-racism that they had to train the bus drivers that were contracted out to take the kids from their homes and then to the school about dismantling their white privilege and the systemic systems of structural oppression that they actually participate in bringing the children into into the cheese bus so then they could bring them to the school, drop them off, and then picking them up at 3:15 so that they could take them home. That's how serious they were way back when, and now with the juice of the George Floyd situation, with all the hype around racism, they're just doubling down, tripling down, and now just a few years later, we have Jim Crow style discrimination in the contracts with the Minneapolis school district. And I must say, if you're gonna go down this road, then I think you should go a little bit harder. I think you should just make it obvious to everybody in the public what you're doing, instead of doing this whole first minority or non-minority gets fired because minority status takes priority. Why don't you make it a little bit more subtle that you're totally in for discrimination and hatred based on race, depending on whether or not the person that you're hating is white. If it's white, then A-okay, you can definitely hate them. Any other group, you need to elevate them artificially, because think about the evil white people who are evil and white because they're white and therefore they're evil. So this is why I'm thinking that for the next contract, what the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers should actually go for is a different tier of seniority. If you're going to go with the system where there's 2 tiers of seniority and minority seniority outweighs white seniority, why don't you just designate white teacher service time at 3/5 the rate of black people or other minority teachers? Just hammer the point home that you're A-okay with discrimination and you want it in the contract. I mean, seriously, you're talking about how this contract is a statement and it's a model for teachers unions around the world. You might as well make the statement that you hate white people and you want to actively be able to discriminate against them because you read some history books and you feel like you're on one team even though that stuff did not happen to you and you are not negatively impacted by it, and the white people you're discriminating against did not do that and didn't negatively impact you. Just do the 3/5 compromise in your teachers union contracts so that way you can just stick it to them in the law, in the bylaws, that you think they're worth less. And by the way, saying that they're worth 3/5 according to these people, probably a bit too high. These people actively hate white people. They consider them to be consciously and unconsciously conspiring against them, and likely they're just happy to see these people get fired so that they can't feed their families. And to all the idiots, to all the regressive white people that suck up to this, who think that their white guilt being satiated is worth more than feeding their families, I hope you don't have kids. I hope you don't have children. I hope you enjoy paying union dues that basically designated you a second-class citizen in contract negotiations, even though it's blatantly and clearly unconstitutional. What we're going to see in the city of Minneapolis is the new Detroit, is the new Chicago, the destruction of a major metropolitan area. It's going to go down. We're going to see crime spike. They're already at record levels of homicide, and it will all be the legacy of one George Floyd. Everybody's going to talk about how, oh, this man has murals everywhere and he's a great man, and all of a sudden we got change in policing. None of that's going to be the case. What you're going to see is a major metropolitan area be decimated by these insane policies that are all compounding all on one another. And guess what? The people who are probably going to get left behind the most are the black people, because if you're working as a teacher and you just found out that you are a second-class citizen in your job, congratulations, you can move and get a job as a teacher somewhere else where they're not actively discriminating against you based on white guilt and hatred of white people. But hey, those are just my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you like this video, show me by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on all my social medias, support me via the support links, sign up on the podcast, leave me reviews. I'm going to start reading them. This has been me talking about the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers contract, discriminating against whites. Till next time.